Hello developers, welcome to my video series on Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on workflow. Today's episode is about software that you'll want to use in building your add-ons for the sim. We'll select some common, inexpensive and expensive programs to get you going on building that amazing add-on that you've always wanted to make. I won't go into extensive detail on how to install these programs as they're typical EXE style where you run it, install it, or an MSI style. You double click and it installs. And finally, there are some downloads that are zip files where you just extract them to a folder. So let's get right to it. I assume you have purchased and installed Microsoft Flight Simulator, the 2020 version. Now you need to turn on dev mode. You do that by starting the sim, and in the options, you go to Options, General Options, select the Developers tab, and turn on the developer mode. You'll see at the top that you've now got a developer mode menu set up. You apply and save that, and then you go back and continue. What you'll be able to do here is now download the SDK. So the software development kit you can download from the developer menu in the help. You can download the core, documentation, samples, Xbox samples if you like, and I suggest also the DA62. Other things you can look at are audio tutorials, and you can open up dev support, and you can even look at the online SDK, which is exactly the same as your downloaded version. You must install the SDK files. When first you need to install is the core files. So install those. Put them somewhere other than your C drive is just my suggestion. I've put mine on my F drive, and I've given it a folder name of MSFS SDK. The rest of the files are then downloaded, and after you install the core files, it's best to reboot your computer so that the information regarding those core SDK files are put into your computer, and the rest of the documentation and samples can be downloaded and installed. The SDK is just a collection of tools and documentation and samples, and it really has nothing to do directly with the in-sim build process. The sim program itself is what's used to build your project. So whenever you download the simulation updates, the SU updates, you get a new SDK inside the sim. But here you get your documentation, you could get samples, you can get schemas, SimConnect SDK information for when you're programming things, WASM information, and so forth. It's basically just a reference that you need in order to build your add-on. You should look around the SDK and all its documentation, and you can see that there's an overwhelming amount of information. I hope to help you master most parts in these tutorials. The SDK has an introduction, it has a source for your samples, has some information on tutorials that you can use, information on the developer mode, how to create external assets, basically your 3D models like your aircraft, content configuration, so all of the information regarding flight files, config files, XML files, the programming API when you get into more advanced topics like SimConnect and AVARs, etc. Some additional information that can't be covered in that. And there's even a how to create an aircraft set of instructions. Now we need to get the tools that are not in the SDK. Namely, your 3D modeling program will use Blender. And these tutorials may help if you use 3ds Max, but I'm focused on Blender. To make your models look real, you'll need a texturing program. I've chosen Substance Painter. This is the most expensive part of your software program requirements. It's usually about $200 US, and you get a year of updates. You can substitute lower price programs like Quixel Mixer or PBR Painter, which is basically a Blender plugin, or the free Build Yourself Armor Paint program. But the less cost, the less functionality. And you may come to the conclusion that you may as well have one multifunction program that does the job, but costs a good chunk of change. Next, you'll want a paint program. This is different from a texturing program in that you manipulate a single texture file in a paint program, while in a texturing program, you will manipulate and manage numerous different texture inputs or maps and the outputs. I'll choose GIMP 3. Well, it's almost available. The current version is 2.10, but we'll get to that later. You could also choose Adobe Paint Shop, which is another high-cost program, or Paint.net, and finally Inkscape for SVG files. You'll need an advanced text editor, and by advanced I mean not just Notepad, but you'll use Notepad++, or maybe you use VS Code. There are also two other utilities that I use, one for searching for text in files, and another for comparing two text files and finding the differences. grepwin and WinMerge are those two programs. The tutorials and episodes will show you how to use these programs as we need them. I won't get into too much detail on how to use these at the moment, and there are good resources out there, and I've listed a few in the documentation here in the comments. Now let's start by getting the 3D modeling software Blender, specifically Blender version 3.3. The Simulator SDK has documentation for using both the Adobe 3ds Max or Blender. Blender is free, so let's use that. Again, more functionality probably in 3ds Max, but Blender is catching up. It's more a matter of individual choice. Blender can be downloaded from the Blender org site, and you can search for the 3.3 version, going into Downloads, then looking for the LTS, Blender LTS here. Then we can pick up Blender 3.3, and you can download the versions here. So basically you're just going to download an MSI file, and then you could install that. It's a simple download. I installed my programs to the F drive, but that's a matter of choice wherever you're comfortable. After you have Blender installed, you can open it up and browse around. Feel free to pause the video now and come back and we'll install Substance Painter. I purchased Substance Painter from Steam so that the install process is basically a Steam download and install. Substance Painter is just like most other Steam program installations, and again, you can open up Substance Painter or choose another program and get familiar with it. I've opened Substance Painter here. It's another one of the programs. Just closing the splash screen, and I can try to start some things that I've already got going. So one of my projects is basically going to make some textures. Now let's download and install GIMP. So you go to the GIMP site, gimp.org, and you can download the files that are required. And after that, after you install GIMP, you can start it, and it basically looks like this. Now we will install Notepad++ from the Notepad++ site. It's an exe file, and you simply double-click like an MSI file to install it. Or you could choose to install VS Code. VS Code is part of this. So Visual Studio Code is another text editor. Notepad has a download site, and you can download the latest, similarly with Visual Studio Code. You'll be using a text editor a lot in developing by working on config files, flight files, and XML files initially. Then later you may go on to more advanced things like JavaScript, JS files, CSS files, and HTML files. There are two utilities I mentioned, grepwin and winmerge. grepwin is a MSI file that we download from a Git site. It's safe to install. And winmerge can be downloaded from their site, and it's an exe. And you can read up on all the functionality and features of these two programs on either the Git site with grepwin, which you could install a release, go into the releases area, and install the x64 MSI file. Well, that was a lot, but we're not done yet. And the last, and I guess most important software package is not really a standalone software package, but a plugin to the Blender program. Asobo has created a GLTF exporter plugin for Blender 3.3, and it's a crucial part of your development process. You build the model in Blender, and then you have to export this model into a file type called GLTF. And that's what is used in the simulator so that you can actually see your model. The exporter plugin file is also from a Git site. So it's the Asobo Git site. And then you go to the GLTF Blender. And we download from the releases. The latest release is 1.3.2. And all you need to do is download this one file, the zip file, IOScene GLTF2 MSFS. And once you download that, we can then install it. But just be careful that you do have Blender 3.3. This exporter will not work with any other version. To install the Asobo Blender GLTF exporter, you start Blender. You can double check that you've got the right version with the Blender icon about Blender 3.3. So we have the correct version. You go into the menu, into the Edit, and then Preferences. Then you can install, and you basically will find where you downloaded your zip file. You select the zip file and install the add-on. The add-on will appear and you have to enable it. You enable it with the check mark. Everything works fine. You can double check that you have version 1.3.2 of the exporter and it's installed. You now have the ability to select materials specific to the Microsoft Flight Simulator. So you can create a material assigned to this object, and all of the parameters associated with that material are available for you to manipulate. There you have it. Most of the tools and programs you'll use to build your amazing add-on. There are other programs and plugins and reference sites, perhaps like your bulk rename utility. This is good for renaming files. It's a pretty cute little utility. Fly-by-wire, they have a importer for GLTF files. So if you ever want to know how the default aircraft work, it has some limited capabilities on importing GLTF files. You could learn JavaScript, and then after that, you could learn TypeScript, which is basically a supercharged JavaScript. And then after you've learned that, you go to the avionics library that Working Title has set up. So the avionics library is in a Microsoft GitHub, and then they have its documentation. Last but not least is my fork of the Asobo exporter. So I've taken Asobo's exporter and added some features and bug fixes to it. It works in Blender 3.6 and it works in 4.1. Now, word of caution, you can take your blend file from 3.3 and make it work in 3.6 or 4, but if you ever wanted to go back, it's very difficult. So I suggest you only start a new project when you change exporters, and this would be a same caution if you stayed with Asobo and used their new versions. And always make backups. In our next episode, we'll get right into it and build a sample aircraft and get it running in the simulator. Before going on to the next video, you should get familiar with the programs that you have just downloaded, and I will assume that you have some experience using them when we do the other tutorials. In the next video, we'll jump right into the SDK sample project, build it, and fly it. It'll be the simple aircraft. Good luck, and see you next time.